For 3 years, Claire Bouchard was the emergency department's invisible woman. She took the overnight shifts nobody wanted, absorbed the insults nobody else had to hear, and cleaned up the messes that somehow always found their way to her hands. She was the nurse you called when a patient was combative, bleeding through their 4th gown, or screaming in 3 languages at 3 a.m. She was the one who showed up, every single time. And nobody at St. Croix Regional Hospital in Thunder Bay, Ontario, had ever once asked why. She was 34. Though the deep lines around her eyes made some of the newer residents assume she was closer to 45. She wore her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed like an act of discipline rather than convenience. Her scrubs were always the same, plain navy blue, slightly too large, purchased in bulk from a medical supply catalog. Nothing about her invited a second look. That was deliberate. The nurses' station at St. Croix was a social ecosystem with its own unwritten laws, and at the top of that ecosystem sat Danielle Fontaine. Danielle was 29, blonde, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything. She had a master's degree in nursing administration from Lakehead University and a habit of making sure everyone within earshot knew it. She wore her hair in loose waves even during 12-hour shifts, a feat that Claire found genuinely baffling. And she managed the emergency floor with the cheerful authority of someone who had confused popularity with competence. Danielle's relationship with Claire was simple. Claire was the workhorse and Danielle was the face. When a difficult procedure went smoothly, Danielle presented the outcome at the morning debrief. When a patient's family left a glowing comment card, Danielle's name somehow ended up mentioned in the response. When a VIP patient required extra attention, Danielle materialized at the bedside with a warm smile and a fresh coffee, while Claire quietly managed the actual clinical picture from the doorway. Claire never complained. She wrote nothing down. She went home to her apartment on Arthur Street, ate whatever was still edible in the refrigerator, and slept with the curtains closed against the afternoon sun. Her apartment was sparse in the way that spaces become when the person living in them has learned not to get attached to things. 1 bookshelf, a folding table, a second-hand couch, and on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, behind a stack of folded blankets, a locked metal box that she never opened and never talked about. The box contained a sacrifice medal, a meritorious service medal, and a photograph of 11 people standing in front of a military transport vehicle somewhere in the Kandahar province of Afghanistan. 9 of them were smiling. 2 of them, including Claire, were not. She was 26 in that photograph. She looked nothing like the woman she had become. Dr. Francois Renaud ran the emergency department at St. Croix. The way a person runs a meeting they resent being in, loud, impatient, and convinced that speed was the same thing as competence. He had trained at McGill, which he mentioned approximately once every 4 days. He spoke to Claire the way he spoke to the supply carts, as necessary equipment, not worth direct eye contact. Once, during a chaotic Friday night when the department was running on 3 nurses and a medical student, Claire had quietly flagged a potential sepsis case that Renaud had classified as a mild UTI. She'd noted the patient's subtle altered mental status, the way his blood pressure had dipped twice in 40 minutes, the faint mottling at his knees. Renaud had looked at her chart notes, looked at her, and said, with the particular weariness of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow, "He's 78, Bouchard. They all present like this. Hang the fluids, I ordered." She had hung the fluids. She had also quietly ordered a lactate level under the patient's GP's standing orders protocol. a technicality that was perfectly within her scope, and when the result came back at 4.1 millimole I, she had laid it silently on Renaud's desk. He'd swept past her to initiate the sepsis bundle without acknowledgement. The patient survived. At the debrief, Renaud described it as a classic late presentation that his team had caught early. Danielle, nodding along, had said nothing. Neither had Claire. If anyone had been watching carefully enough, they would have noticed the anomalies. They would have noticed that Claire never flinched during an active resuscitation. Not once, in 3 years. While other nurses, good nurses, experienced nurses, still carried a visible tension in their shoulders during a full code, Claire moved through the chaos the way water moves through a narrow channel, fast, purposeful, without resistance. She knew where every piece of equipment was without looking. She could read a cardiac monitor the way most people read a clock, and she was usually 3 steps ahead of whatever crisis was unfolding before the attending physician had finished putting on their gloves. But people tend not to see what they've already decided isn't worth looking at. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in late February. The temperature outside had dropped to -23, and the emergency department was running lean. 2 nurses on the floor, a first-year resident named Dr. Marcus Webb, and Claire, who was supposed to have ended her shift 40 minutes earlier, but had stayed to finish a medication reconciliation that Danielle had left incomplete. Danielle had gone home early with a migraine. She had mentioned the migraine 3 times in the preceding hour. The trauma phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Claire picked it up before the second ring. St. Croix Ed Bouchard. The paramedic on the other end was breathing hard. Incoming critical, ETA 4 minutes. MVA on Highway 11 northbound, head-on with a transport truck. Patient is female, 31, unrestrained driver, ejected from vehicle. We have a suspected tension pneumo on the right, GCS of 8, BP 70 palp, HR 142. She's got a tib-fib fracture left leg and what looks like blunt abdominal trauma. We've pushed 2 liters of saline and she's not responding. If you don't have a surgeon standing by, call one now. Copy, Claire said. 4 minutes. She hung up and did not raise her voice. She pressed the overhead alert button, which flooded the department with a flat, pulsing tone, and turned to Dr. Webb, who had appeared at the doorway of the supply alcove, looking like a man who had just heard something he wasn't prepared for. Trauma incoming, Claire said. Tension pneumo suspected right side, hemorrhagic shock, altered GCS. I need a thoracostomy kit opened and at bay 1. I need the rapid infuser primed with O negative. Call the lab right now and tell them we're activating massive transfusion protocol. Page Renaud and tell him to get here. Not in 20 minutes. Now. Webb stared at her. Dr. Webb. Her voice didn't get louder. It got quieter, which was somehow worse. Move. He moved. The paramedics came through the bay doors at 11:51, and Claire had already positioned herself at the head of the gurney before the wheels stopped rolling. The patient, young, dark-haired, her face almost unrecognizable from the trauma, was making the shallow, desperate attempts at breathing that Claire had learned to recognize years before she'd ever set foot in a Canadian hospital. The right side of her chest wasn't moving the way it should. The trachea had shifted slightly left. Her neck veins were distended. Classic tension, Claire said, to no one in particular. She was already gloved. Bouchard, we should wait for Renaud, Webb said from somewhere behind her. She has approximately 90 seconds before her heart stops, Claire replied without turning around. Renaud is 12 minutes away. Hand me the 14 gauge. That's a needle decompression. You can't. "Hand me the needle, Dr. Webb." He hesitated for 1 second. Then he handed her the needle. She inserted it at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right side. The hiss of trapped air escaping was immediate and unmistakable. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been sitting at 71%, began climbing. Webb watched the number move upward like he was watching something he didn't fully believe. The chest tube followed, a procedure that existed in a grayer area of Claire's nursing scope, in a facility with a documented standing protocol for critical care, RNs, in the absence of a physician, which St. Croix had adopted 2 years earlier, and which Renaud had never read because he'd assumed it didn't apply to anyone worth applying it to. Claire moved through the procedure with the particular economy of motion that comes not from simulation labs or clinical placements, but from having done it in conditions where the tools were less sterile and the margin for error was smaller than anyone in Thunder Bay had ever needed to consider. The patient's blood pressure began to recover, 90/60, then 100/68. Webb stood at the foot of the bed with his hands open at his sides, watching Claire work, and said nothing for a long time. Dr. Renaud arrived at 12:09 a.m., still in his coat, his hair uncombed. He surveyed the bay, the chest tube in place, the draining canister, the climbing vitals on the monitor, the patient now breathing on her own in a way she had not been 12 minutes ago, and he looked at Webb. "Good instinct initiating the decompression," Renaud said, clapping the resident on the shoulder. "That's the kind of decisive action that saves lives. You probably just made her family very happy." Webb opened his mouth. Claire was already at the medication cart, drawing up a maintenance dose, her back to the room. She didn't turn around. She didn't correct the record. She never did. Renaud ordered the patient transferred to the ICU for surgical consult, took a phone call from the hospital administrator, and left. Webb stood beside the medication cart for a moment. "I didn't do that," he said quietly. "I know," Claire said. "I should tell him." "You can," she said. "That's your call." She handed him the patient's updated chart and walked toward the supply room to restock what they'd used, because someone had to. The patient's name was Corporal Elise Trottier. She was 31 years old and had been driving home from a 2-week visit with her parents in Nipigon when the transport truck crossed the center line on a curve. She was with the 3rd Canadian Division, based out of Petawawa, and she had completed 2 tours. One in Latvia as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence, and one in Mali, where her forward medical team had been involved in an extraction operation that had made a small mention in a Defense Department press release that nobody outside the military had read. She had been scheduled to begin an advanced paramedic certification course the following month. She spent 4 days in the ICU. On the 5th day, she was moved to a step-down unit. On the 7th day, she was sitting up. The hospital administrator, a man named Gerald Cassette, who wore a lanyard with his own photograph on it and had framed his Rotary Club award in the hallway outside his office, had learned about Corporal Trottier's military affiliation within 24 hours of her admission. He had also learned, through a contact at the base, that Trottier's commanding officer and several members of her unit intended to visit her during her recovery. Cassette moved quickly. He rescheduled a media availability that had been planned for the week prior, confirmed the presence of a journalist from the Chronicle Journal, and personally briefed Danielle Fontaine, who had returned from her migraine with remarkable speed once the words "military visit" and "press" had appeared in the same sentence, on how the department should present itself. Danielle rearranged the shift schedule. She assigned herself as Corporal Trottier's primary contact nurse for the morning of the visit and moved Claire to a supply audit in the basement storage wing. "It's just an administrative task," Danielle said, not quite meeting Claire's eyes. "I need someone reliable down there. You know the inventory system better than anyone." "Sure," Claire said. She picked up the clipboard and went downstairs. At 1000 hours, the main entrance doors of St. Croix Regional opened, and a group of 6 Canadian Forces personnel entered the lobby. They were in uniform, not the working dress of a routine base day, but the full ceremonial service uniform, dark and pressed and weighted with the particular gravity of formal military acknowledgement. Leading them was a woman, Chief Warrant Officer Patricia Guerin, Senior Non-Commissioned Officer of the 3rd Division's Medical Support Unit, 47 years old, with the composed and permanently measuring expression of someone who had spent decades evaluating situations and people with equal precision. Behind her walked a captain, 2 master corporals, and 2 corporals, all moving with the contained, synchronized energy of people who were there for a specific purpose and did not intend to be redirected. Gerald Cassette met them at the lobby with his hand extended and his most institutional smile in place. Danielle stood slightly behind him, positioned for photographs. "Chief Warrant Officer, welcome to St. Croix Regional," Cassette said. "We're so pleased Corporal Trottier is recovering well. We've taken exceptional care of her here. I'd love to introduce you to our team, particularly our head ED nurse, Danielle, who has been coordinating Corporal Trottier's care from the very beginning." Guerin shook his hand. Her expression did not change. "Thank you, Mr. Cassette. We appreciate the facility's care. Before we go up, I need to speak with the nurse who was on duty the night Corporal Trottier was admitted." Cassette blinked. "That would be, well, there were a few staff on that evening. The nurse who performed the needle decompression and placed the chest tube," Guerin said, with the patient specificity of someone who had read a clinical report very carefully. Corporal Trottier's surgical team documented both procedures in her transfer notes. The timing indicates they were completed before the attending physician arrived. "I'd like to speak with that nurse." Danielle's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Cassette turned to look at her. Danielle said nothing. She was calculating. Dr. Renaud, who had appeared in the lobby a few minutes earlier with a freshly pressed coat and a plan to be photographed alongside the military delegation, cleared his throat. "Chief Warrant Officer, I think there may be some confusion in the documentation. Dr. Webb was the attending on that case, and I myself was." The paramedic report and the nursing notes both indicate that a registered nurse with the initials CB initiated emergency intervention prior to physician arrival, Guerin said, without inflection. The procedures were within the facility's critical care protocol. The documentation is clear. Who is CB? The lobby was very quiet. From the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor, because the elevator in the East Wing had been out of service for 11 days, and Claire had stopped waiting for it, a figure emerged carrying a clipboard and wearing navy scrubs that were slightly too large and needed replacing. She was reading a column of inventory numbers and didn't look up immediately. She almost walked past the entire gathering before something. The particular quality of silence in the lobby, the sound of dress shoes on linoleum, some frequency of awareness she'd spent years trying to muffle, made her stop. She looked up. Chief Warrant Officer Guerin looked at her for approximately 1 second. Then Guerin said quietly and with absolute certainty, "Bouchard." Claire stood completely still, The clipboard was still in her hands. Garin turned to the men and women behind her and said one word, "Attention." 6 people came to attention in the lobby of Sainte Croix Regional Hospital with a precision that made the fluorescent lights seem to rattle. Garin herself straightened, turned fully toward Claire, and raised her right hand in a salute, so sharp it looked like it had been rehearsed 1,000 times and hadn't lost anything in the repetition. The rest of the unit followed. Gerald Cossette's hand was still extended toward no one. Danielle had stopped breathing. Renaud had gone very still, in the way that people go still when they understand that something is happening that they have permanently misread. Claire didn't move for a long moment. Her hands tightened once on the clipboard. Then she set it down on the reception desk beside her, squared her shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with memory, and offered a single, direct nod. "Stand easy, Chief Warrant Officer," she said. Her voice, for the first time in 3 years, was not quiet. It wasn't loud. It was simply clear, the way a signal is clear when there's nothing interfering with the frequency. Garin dropped the salute and exhaled once. "Corporal Bouchard. Master Corporal Bouchard," she corrected herself, and then something moved through her expression. "I'm sorry. Sergeant Bouchard, by the time you were medically released. We confirmed that this week." "It was a long time ago," Claire said. "It was not long enough ago for us to have forgotten it," Garin said. She turned to face the lobby at large. The administrator, the physician, the charge nurse, the journalist, who had his phone out and was no longer entirely sure what he was supposed to be photographing. In 2018, Master Corporal Claire Bouchard was part of a forward medical team conducting a medical evacuation in northern Mali. The extraction came under direct fire. The team's primary medic was wounded in the first minutes. Bouchard assumed command of care for 4 critically injured personnel and 1 civilian in an unsecured position without backup for 38 minutes until the second helicopter arrived. She performed 2 emergency surgical interventions in the field. All 5 patients survived. The lobby was the kind of silent that only happens when a group of people are recalibrating something they thought they understood. She was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for those actions, Garin continued. She was medically released 18 months later, following injuries sustained in the same theater. She asked that her file be closed and her records kept private. We respected that. She paused, until Corporal Trottier's surgical notes landed on my desk 4 days ago, and I read the initials CB, and I thought, there is only one person I have ever met who would do this quietly and then go restock the supply room. Claire said nothing for a moment. Then, she would have died. Yes, Garin said, she would have. Dr. Renaud stepped forward. His voice had a new quality to it. Less certain, more managed. With respect, Chief Warrant Officer, Nurse Bouchard exceeded her scope of practice. The chest tube placement was a liability issue regardless of outcome. We'll need to review. Francois. Garin didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply turned her head and looked at him with the expression of a person who has assessed a great many situations and found this one among the least complicated. Your nurse saved the life of a Canadian Forces soldier in the absence of physician intervention, using a protocol your own hospital adopted and apparently never briefed your attending staff on. The only liability I see in this room is the institutional culture that had her doing supply audits in the basement while you arranged to be photographed. Hurt. Renaud said nothing. His jaw was working, but nothing was coming out of it. Danielle had taken a half step backward until she was nearly behind a potted plant. Burnt. Cossette looked at the journalist, who was looking at his phone, and then Cossette looked at the floor. Dr. Webb had come down from the second floor at some point during Guérine's account. He had heard the part about Molly. He had also heard Renaud's objection. He was 26 years old, and he had spent the past 7 days telling himself that the thing he had done, or rather, had not done, had been a minor omission that would correct itself naturally. He understood, watching the lobby around him, that there was no version of this that corrected itself naturally. He raised his hand, which was not a gesture he had ever made in a professional context before, and which felt slightly absurd, but he did it anyway. "Excuse me," he said. Everyone looked at him. "I need to correct the record on the clinical documentation," Webb said. He was talking to Renaud but looking at Claire. "I was the physician present during Corporal Trottier's resuscitation. I did not initiate the intervention. He took a breath. I was not prepared for what I was seeing, and I froze. Nurse Bouchard assessed the patient, identified the tension pneumothorax, performed the needle decompression, placed the chest tube, and managed the entire resuscitation. I watched. When Dr. Renaud arrived and credited me, I did not correct him. I should have done it that night. I'm correcting it now." Renaud turned on him. "Marcus, you are not required." "I know I'm not required," Webb said. "I'm doing it anyway." The journalist had stopped pretending he was doing anything other than recording. Cossette could see the story reshaping itself in real time, and it was not the story he had prepared for. Guérin looked at Claire. "Is any of that inaccurate?" "No," Claire said. "It's accurate." "Then here's what happens next." Guérine wasn't addressing Cossette or Renaud. She was addressing the room in the way that senior non-commissioned officers address rooms. Not as a request for compliance, but as a statement of how things are going to be. Corporal Trottier's care record is going to be corrected to accurately reflect who managed her resuscitation. The Canadian Forces Health Services Directorate is going to submit a formal commendation to this hospital's governing board, recognizing Nurse Bouchard's actions. And I am going to personally follow up with the College of Nurses of Ontario regarding the standing protocol under which she acted, because I want it on record that she did not exceed anything. She simply did what needed doing. She looked at Cossette. "Additionally, I understand that your facility has been in the process of developing a civilian military emergency skills integration program for Northwestern Ontario. We have been looking for a lead clinical educator with field experience, someone who can teach emergency staff what it actually looks like when things go wrong and there's no one else in the room." She paused. "I think you're looking at her," Cossette said. "Yes, absolutely, whatever Claire needs." Danielle said nothing. She was very focused on a point approximately 18 inches above everyone's heads. Renaud said, "This is a personnel matter that should be handled through." "Francois," Claire said. He stopped. It was the first time in 3 years she had addressed him by his first name. She hadn't planned it. She wasn't sure why she did it, except that something about the way the morning had gone had rearranged certain decisions she'd made about how much space to take up. "2 weeks ago," she said, "Bed 11 had a DVT that you cleared for discharge because his D-dimer was borderline and you had 3 other patients. I flagged it on the chart. You overrode it. He came back by ambulance 48 hours later with a pulmonary embolism. He's on the 4th floor right now." She paused. "I kept the original chart note. I kept all of them." The quality of silence in the lobby changed. "I've been keeping them for 2 years, Claire continued, "not because I wanted to use them, because I learned a long time ago that the people responsible for protecting others need documentation, and in the absence of people doing their jobs, you do it yourself. She looked at Cosette. Your department has a quality assurance process that hasn't had an independent audit in 4 years. I'd suggest scheduling one. Cosette nodded vigorously. Renaud had gone the color of old chalk. Hurt. Guerine watched all of this with an expression that might, in different light, have been satisfaction. Surgeon Bouchard, she said finally. Claire looked at her. Corporal Trottier asked me to tell you something if I found you. Guerine reached into her uniform pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, handwritten, slightly uneven, clearly written by someone still working around a chest tube. She said to give you this. Claire took the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting said, I don't know what you did or how you did it, but I woke up and they told me someone kept me here. Thank you for keeping me here. Claire folded the paper again. She held it for a moment. Then she put it in the pocket of her 2 large scrubs. Tell her to finish her paramedic certification, Claire said. She'll be good at it. Guerine smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that appears when something expected has finally happened. I'll tell her. She offered her hand. Claire shook it. The lobby began, slowly, to breathe again. The journalist was writing. Cosette was already moving toward damage control. Webb was standing near the elevator, with his arms at his sides, looking like a person who had just made a decision they intended to keep. Danielle had slipped out through a side corridor, though she would have to come back eventually, because her car keys were at the nurse's station. Renaud left without saying anything else. He would submit a leave request the following morning, and the peer review process that began 3 weeks later would take 8 months. Claire gave her documentation to the Quality Assurance Office on a Thursday afternoon, quietly, the same way she did everything. And she went home and slept without the curtains closed for the first time in longer than she could remember. She didn't take the program director position that Guerin's office formally offered in April. She thought about it for 2 weeks, and then she called the number on the letter and said, I'd rather stay in the department if it's possible to consult from there. There are things that still need fixing, and I'd rather fix them than teach someone else to do it in a room without any patients in it. The woman on the other end of the line said that could be arranged. Claire thanked her and hung up. She went back to the ED that evening. She restocked the crash cart that someone had left half empty. She found a medication error in the overnight handoff notes and corrected it. She made a pot of coffee because there wasn't any, and she left a cup on Webb's desk with a post-it that said good call in her handwriting, which was small and even, and took up exactly as much space as it needed. The overnight shift was cold and fast and short-staffed, and hers. She was, finally, exactly where she was supposed to be. I keep thinking about that clipboard. The one Claire set down on the reception desk before she straightened her shoulders. Not dramatically, not for anyone watching, just because something in her remembered how to stand. 3 years of deliberately making herself smaller, and it took about 4 seconds for all of it to come undone. Not because someone rescued her, because the truth had been accumulating quietly the whole time, and eventually it ran out of room. That's the part that stays with me. Not the salute, not Guerine's account of Molly, not even Renaud going pale in the lobby. What stays with me is the locked box in the bedroom closet, the folded blankets in front of it, the decision Claire made repeatedly every single day to know exactly who she was and say nothing about it to anyone. That takes a particular kind of strength that I don't think gets talked about enough. the kind that doesn't need an audience to stay intact. I've been in situations where the easiest thing would have been to let someone else take the credit and walk away clean. And I'll be honest, sometimes I did. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I told myself it didn't matter, that the outcome was what counted, that I didn't need the acknowledgement. Some of that was true. Some of it was a way of avoiding the harder thing, which is staying present and doing the work, even when the people around you have decided you're invisible. Claire didn't avoid it. She just kept doing it. Every chart note, every intercepted error, every medication she quietly swapped before a patient could be harmed by someone else's carelessness. That's not passivity. That's a discipline most people never develop because it requires you to care more about what's right than about being seen caring about it. What Webb did matters, too. He was 26 years old, under institutional pressure, with a straightforward path to saying nothing and moving on. He raised his hand anyway. That choice, small, slightly awkward, made in a hospital lobby in front of people with cameras, is exactly the kind of moment where character either forms or doesn't. He'd had 7 days of rationalizing the silence. Then he stopped. I think about how different the outcome looks if he doesn't stop. Claire still knows what she did. Guérin still figures it out from the notes. But Webb carries that with him for years, maybe forever, and the version of himself he becomes is shaped by that weight. The things we don't say when we should say them have a way of doing that. And then there's what Claire chose at the end. A formal position, a real salary, a title that matched her actual abilities. All of it offered and declined, not out of false modesty, but because she understood something about where the work actually needed doing. She went back to the department. She fixed the crash cart. She left a cup of coffee and 2 words on a desk. That's it. That's the whole thing. I don't think you can manufacture that kind of clarity. I think it comes from having been tested in ways that stripped everything else away, and from deciding, in the aftermath of that, what you actually value. Claire valued the patients in the beds. That's it. Everything else, the title, the credit, the photograph in the corridor, was noise. The quiet people are not always the small ones. Sometimes they're the ones who already know exactly how loud they can be, and have simply decided it isn't necessary yet.